and on online dispute resolution. And he's been with the Berkman Center, visiting professor there, and at Brandeis, graduate of Yale, and has published very broadly on these areas. Maybe I'll introduce the two Amy's now, so we don't have to do with the introductions later. After Ethan. Ethan speaks for about 15 minutes or so,
Okay.
or 20, something like that. We'll get Amy Schmitz on. She's at the Missouri School of Law. Before that, she was at Colorado. Amy teaches a very broad area: contracts, lawyering, online dispute resolution. She writes on secure transactions, arbitration, international arbitration, and has really sort of delved into this area of blockchain and ODR for blockchain. She published a book that came out around the same time ours did, with Colin Rule, who's when Ethan's called the grandfather of ODR, Colin is called the father. So this book focuses on dispute ODR for e-commerce, and she's now working a lot in terms of ODR and blockchain. It's writing in that area, and it'd be very interesting to hear. What we expect to hear from her is a focus on the various ODR providers that are emerging now for the blockchain arena. And then we'll have Amy Wan on. She's the co-founder and CEO of SageWise, which is a legal tech blockchain company. She hosts the Law and Blockchain podcast and has authored the Bloomberg Law Practice Guide to ICOs and LexisNexis Private Equity Practice Guide. She was previously a partner at a boutique securities law firm and general counsel at a real estate crowdfunding platform. So she's living these issues. She founded Legal Hackers LA, which programs around the intersection of law and technology, and was named one of the 10 women to watch in legal technology by the American Bar Association 2014, and one of 18 millennials changing legal tech in 2018. So I think that's probably the background we need, and without further ado.
Well, thanks very much, Orna. It's always a pleasure to visit here. And I guess the challenge for me was that it wasn't totally clear to me how many of you were even understood what the blockchain is. Is there anybody who could define what the blockchain is? So I'm not going to do that either, but blockchain obviously has captured popular attention and the attention of large companies. And I'm going to, I think, stand so I can see what I put together earlier and not get in the way. What Orna, I guess, told me to talk about was how somebody interested in and working in the dispute resolution field would approach this highly technical and rather hard to describe process that for some time, although not as much lately, but for some time was denying that any disputes would occur. But to get to the very beginning of dispute resolution, how many of you are in the law school, in student faculty, and any of you in the technology field? Okay. Well, then you're aware that someone interested in dispute resolution should be interested in more than resolution. For systems, new systems, one question I always ask is it generating disputes, or is it resolving disputes, or is it preventing disputes? New technological developments, it's mystifying to me that they almost never talk about how many disputes are generated. It takes years for that to happen. But we know that the familiar technologies we have, buying and selling online, communicating online, all of those processes generate huge numbers of disputes. So in case some of you are unaware of it, eBay, which handles disputes between buyers and sellers, handled or managed 60 million disputes last year. Alibaba, which does this, sort of the same thing, claims to have handled 100 million disputes each year. So obviously, these entities have figured out, have understood that they're generating disputes, even though the percentage of transactions that lead to disputes is very, very small. So how many of you have bought things online? Ever? At least one person doesn't seem to have. And maybe she's smarter than the rest of us. But why is Amazon so successful? Because it's into preventing disputes. So you buy anything on Amazon, at least in the States, if you buy anything from Amazon, they'll take it back. No questions asked. Well, that's important to them because then people will be willing to overcome the mistrust, the kind of inherent mistrust that there is. But for the dispute resolution community, there's always been more focus on resolution than on generating disputes or even preventing disputes. How do we, with the blockchain, I think it's unavoidable that we have to ask how many disputes are being generated, because the early versions of the blockchain suggested that there were no disputes being generated. And sorry. For anybody in the dispute resolution field, it was essentially obvious that you couldn't have transactions or relationships and no disputes. But this is some of the language that we saw over the last 2-3 years. And first quotation suggests that blockchain eliminates transaction disputes. So when I see something like that, I say, impossible. Impossible to have lots of transactions without any disputes. But for a period of time, that was the kind of accepted dogma. Blockchain will be lawyer-free by design. Well, again, when I look at that, I say to myself, impossible. Those of you who are in law school, this is not going to prevent you from having a career. Quite to the contrary. But to skip over the next one, the assumption was, people are trying to explain blockchain, was that the technology, built into the technology were systems to build trust, facilitate expertise, and deliver convenience. And those are the, to me at least, the inherent qualities of dispute resolution. Without even one of these, if there's no trust, there are not going to be sales and there are not going to be settlement of disputes. And without expertise or providing convenience, they're also not going to be expertise. So on the other hand, why hasn't there been more discussion of technology and the blockchain among dispute resolution professionals? In a week or so, the American Bar Association's section on dispute resolution will have its annual meeting, and there's not one session there devoted to the blockchain. And my suspicion is that almost nobody attending that meeting will have paid any attention to dispute resolution. But over 100 years ago, Oliver Wendell Holmes said the law's behind the times, and that is as it should be. Is it? I don't think, if Holmes were standing right next to me, I'd say, a lot of his other readings make total sense, but this one is at least debatable. On the other hand, uh, dispute resolution is not a priority for the computer science field. So at my university, when wanted to collaborate with computer scientists, it happened, but it wasn't easy. So I attribute a great deal to this lack of interdisciplinary research. Because if you go into, if you ask computer scientists about dispute resolution, where does that enter their research? It's rather rare to find. And if you ask dispute resolution professionals, they pay more attention to technology than they used to. But still, I don't think it's something that's on the minds of dispute resolution professionals. But some of you can correct me if you think I'm wrong. And if you want to interrupt me, fair game as well. So in addition, those of us who have realized that there is a link between technology and dispute resolution have come to terms with the fact that we've been almost always wrong in predicting what kinds of disputes would occur. So if you had been alive in 1975, there's no way you could have predicted what would happen 10 years later. No one in the 90s predicted accurately what disputes would happen in the 2000s, and getting to the bottom whether and how a new technology would generate a dispute was rarely considered by inventors and programmers. It's kind of mysterious, I think, to me that that's the case, because programmers really are never finished programming. There's implicit in the work of programming that it's a continuous process. So if Microsoft is sending you patches or other systems to fix any fixes, by implication, there were mistakes in the previous version. And I think if there were conscious efforts to understand ahead of time what might happen, we would be in a little better shape. But I think it's impossible. And I think programmers would agree with this, that it's impossible to predict or find every bug ahead of time. But I think what we can do is look at the sources of disputes. So we can talk about this later, because it's really at the heart of what I believe. And that is, if you look at transactions and relationships, if you have a technology that facilitates transactions and helps to encourages or build relationships, if that's what's happening, disputes are sure to follow. So this, I think, is, I guess I would say, at the heart of my presentation. But go a little further, and if it's not like transactions or relationships, but more transactions, novel transactions, and perhaps most importantly, complex transactions. So the systems that we use every day, but may not frequently try to analyze, are incredibly complex systems. We have two people sitting in the United States watching this, I think. I mean, that would amaze, anybody alive or working in the field, say 30 or 40 years ago. But even this thing, a lot of complex systems just built into this. So the end result is, as I said earlier, all new technologies generate disputes. Successful technologies, perhaps mysteriously or not, may increase the numbers of the disputes over these transactions and relationships. So it's not that more successful systems reduce reduce the number of disputes, but rather more successful systems increase disputes because they increase numbers of transactions and relationships. Is that clear or debatable, or? I'm sorry. Yes.
Doesn't sound necessarily the transactions are more complex, more streamlined. It sounds actually less. Online transactions that some of us are familiar with as consumer ones sound, at least as far as the interface is concerned, very non-complex. So unless there's a theory of complexity here behind the curtains,
right.
The interface is transparent too. And I don't know if there are more transactions than used to be. Again, intuitively, I guess there are. But it's just a lot of transactions are being shifted from the offline world to the online world. So people buy less Walmart, etc., and more Amazon or eBay. But I don't know if they have many more transactions. Maybe, but there have to be numbers. It can't be just intuitive. And the third, the more streamlined the transactions are, and the more predictable the outcome of dispute is, actually there'll be less, because for instance, technology generates more complex transactions and relationships. The consumer transactions that you note here, eBay and Alibaba, I don't know if they're more complex. They're more complex technologically, but I'm not so sure if they're more complex legally or even as far as the interface of the consumer is. All these make sense in a way, but all right.
No,
I guess there's science behind this.
yes, you'd like some numbers,
yeah,
other than the numbers I suggested, because I think with the eBay example or Alibaba, the argument is more than intuitive. I mean, if eBay has disputes in 0.1% of its transactions, and that number is 60 million, and eBay didn't exist before any of this was going on that one, I'd say I disagree with you. But, and if we're talking about something other than the interface, which I would agree, the goal is to make it simpler and simpler, which is how eBay can attract, or Amazon can attract many millions of users. I guess I was referring to what's under behind the screen. So in terms of complexity, again, I don't have the numbers, and maybe I should, but I think it's arguable. Yes, it's definitely intuitive, but we're looking for numbers on all of these things, and unfortunately, the eBay and Alibaba numbers come up routinely because those were two entities that were willing to share data. Amazon wouldn't share any data, but I'm mildly surprised that you disagree with me on these.
No, disagreement. It's again, I'm being introspective here. I tend to agree with this intuitively, and then I challenge my own intuition.
Yeah,
I mean, do I
okay.
really know that this is the case, or just I just go with the flow because of all the things. I don't know. But let's go ahead, because what you.
No, it's in 1998, I conducted a small pilot project for eBay, and we had 200 disputes in 2 weeks. That was an enormous number.
Most of them were conformity, or because you can't not pay, right? So,
Yeah. So what I was.
it's mostly conformity. People can get what they have.
Oh, yes, something broke, something, yeah. There were only 5 or 6 categories. And the reason the eBay system can work, you know, is that there are only 5 or 6 categories of things that can go wrong. If you limit the number of things that can go wrong, you limit the software can handle it more easily. But when I was asked to do this, before I did it, my son said, well, why don't we buy something on eBay? And at that time, took a week for the item to come because we used checks. We sent checks in the mail. And my son was looking in the mailbox every day for 2 weeks. And it was hard to deal with.
So transactions now are less complex today, right?
They are, well,
Less complex because you use PayPal and the that makes sense. The simpler they are.
but terrific. Well, let them fight it out.
I think the last estimate I heard was a billion transactions.
Yeah.
1 to 3% go wrong.
So these numbers don't mean anything unless you know how many transactions this takes offline and how many disputes have offline that maybe we don't have useful systems to pursue. Right? Also to pursue, people give up on online. I don't know how many times people return stuff to stores, and because every time you return something to a store, it's a dispute just being resolved on the spot. So the numbers that you give me from one point of the aisle without showing me how much is took away from the offline world, that's the problem I have. I guess we do consume more because it's just easier to consume more, and if we consume more ostensibly, then we have.
I'll move on. We can talk about this later. But for those of you who are not in the dispute resolution field, modern dispute resolution, alternative dispute resolution, meaning face-to-face mediation, arbitration, dates from about 1976, with understanding by our federal government that courts couldn't handle large quantities of disputes. In the mid-90s, you have the beginning of ODR, online dispute resolution, sort of a recognition that alternative dispute resolution was not going to function very well. And the need to find systems that were not face-to-face. So ODR, not my prediction, but rather well-known figure in the legal technology field, Richard Susskind, wrote that this is how most disputes will be settled. So he's predicting, he's not giving any numbers either, but if you disagree with this, you know, wait a year and see what things are like. His name?
Not with the veracity.
Okay. No. I appreciate your interest in this and your perspective. But for the blockchain, to get back or get to blockchain finally, I said before we had trouble predicting disputes ahead of time. Well, with the blockchain, we're like what it was 40 years ago. The internet of the 70s and 80s, the internet was developed or discovered in 1969. There were, I don't know how this links to your point of view, but really minimal number of disputes in the 70s, the 80s, and then a lot of growth when e-commerce began. The US government, which controlled the internet for at least 25 years, until the mid-1990s, prohibited online commercial transactions. So we didn't have any online commercial transaction disputes, but that changed. And the question with the blockchain is, I think the question is, we could understand what was happening in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But from my point of view, those advocating use of the blockchain perhaps have made some mistakes. And if none of you could define this, I think I asked this question before you came in, so you might have been able to answer that you could explain what the blockchain is. No?
It's a theological question.
Theological. Well, Israel's, I guess, an appropriate place to consider theological questions. But it's rather mysterious how much attention is devoted to a system that virtually, you know, a very small segment of even the computer science field pays a lot of attention to, because it's difficult to understand. The internet, buying and selling, yes, there's complexity underneath, but the acts are pretty simple. On the other hand, blockchain employs strange language, tokens, ledgers, coins. You may understand what these mean, but not in the context of the blockchain. And there are few use cases. So in 1995, when the internet really was opened up for commerce, there were big companies. Amazon grew very fast. eBay grew very fast. But here, you have Bitcoin and really, I don't think much else. And any of you have any Bitcoins? No? Yes, you own. Well, I don't know if it's a good wish. But Bitcoins fluctuate in value, but Bitcoins are used more for investment than transactions. And again, how can we rely on a system that has virtually no use cases? So it doesn't meet the criteria of being convenient, trustworthy, or intelligent. And same thing here. If the blockchain, at least, I guess I'll leave you with this. If the blockchain is going to have value and understanding, the language needs to change. But there are areas in which data is handled so poorly that they may succeed in providing use cases. So just take some health records. Health records, at least in the United States, don't work very well, and online there are more disputes. So again, I'd say it's more than intuitive that I'm sorry, land transfers. Yeah, we could probably add to the list at least 5 more areas in which data quality can be improved. And the blockchain is designed, I think, for that. But we don't have that yet. And the fact that we can recognize where there's a need, but not have use cases, should suggest that a lot more work needs to be done. So I think Orna's eager for me to finish. I'd be happy to answer questions or.
Hi, Amy. Can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes. So we already went through your bio. So I won't repeat it now. And we have a very nice and curious group ready to hear you. I think we can put up Amy's PowerPoint presentation.
I was going to share it from my screen. If
you want to share it? Okay, great.
Whichever is easier for you all. Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you to Orna, thank you to Ethan, thank you to the university for having me virtually there. I wish I were there, sitting there in person. It sounds like a really informative and great presentation that I really enjoyed Ethan's presentation. It's a great launching point for mine. So what I'm going to be talking about here is, hopefully everybody can see my slides now.
Perfect. And you can also feel free to talk a little bit about smart contracts, because it turns out that the next session is not devoted to that area. So you can talk a little bit more about that if you
Okay. Sure. Yeah, all right. And please stop me or ask me questions along the way, because there's a lot here, but a lot to cover, a lot happening. So just a brief, really short, and I think it's important to understand the context of sort of how smart contracts are going to generate disputes. The idea that legal code, that computer coding is going to prevent all disputes by virtue of smart contracts, I think is ridiculous, to say the least, because there will be disputes. But originally in 1994, Nick Szabo was really the legal scholar and cryptographer that realized that decentralized ledgers could be used on the blockchain for these smart contracts. And the idea basically is that you would use computer code, and that the computer code would basically run the blockchain and would allow for these agreements and essentially payment systems to be set up and run purely by computer code, without need for human intervention, without need to trust the courts or to trust any sort of lawyers that would be involved. So it's really kind of almost an anarchist idea, an idea that we want to eliminate courts and lawyers in transaction processes. The idea was it would kind of operate, and I am not the first one to come up with this sort of mental picture, but the idea of a vending machine structure in a way, in the sense that it operates in accordance with if-then correlations. So I think of it, you know, you go up to the vending machine, right? You put in your coins and you choose potato chips, or you choose a candy bar, and whatever you choose, you cannot change your mind later. It's immutable. Then the transaction happens. There's not a person that has to take place in the process. You don't need intermediaries. You don't need any sort of lawyers. And so it saves time and money, and that's the essential idea. And really it's setting up, you know, automatic payment systems. The place where I suppose the value is you can replace things like letters of credit and complex financing. I also teach secure transactions as one of the classes I teach here at the university, and it's very complicated in figuring out all the different documents and filings that are required when you use collateral to secure payments. So it's also about trust, and it's a matter of who you trust in the process. And that's kind of where smart contracts can provide some sort of value, is where you, if indeed you trust the computer code, if you trust the mathematics involved, then that would be better for a person who does not trust the courts, who does not want to have to rely on currencies. In fact, when you even think of the birth of cryptocurrencies and the birth of Bitcoin, it came down to the fact that people don't necessarily trust the World Bank. They don't necessarily trust banking systems. We don't clearly have currencies linked to gold as we did way back in the day. So the idea is a matter of trust, and sort of a code-based trust, and trusting the math. The idea, however, is that they would be contracts. Well, some of us, I also teach contract law here at the university, and as a contracts professor, I sort of cringe, because these code-based payment systems are not really contracts, right? They're not really sort of what we think of in terms of offer, acceptance, consideration, and all the requirements that go to a meeting of the minds. Because really, you are just talking about code-based payment systems. You're talking about algorithmic code also, where you don't have a clear offer, acceptance, and consideration. Also, very importantly, it's decentralized. The whole idea of the blockchain, in fact, the sort of value, the benefit, is that it's decentralized, right? So if a hacker wants to go in and hack, for example, Equifax or a major bank, and they've got everything stored in one location on the cloud, once the hacker gets in, they have all the information. They can completely take over. With a decentralized ledger and with these smart contract-based systems, like Ethan was saying, which is absolutely true, where you have documents, for example, and you're worried about trust. Well, if it's decentralized, there's not one central location that can be hacked and all the information taken away. But that also creates a problem for courts, because in the world of contract law and in the world of the courts, we talk about jurisdiction. Well, if it's decentralized and it's all the information and the contract itself could be said to be all over the world in millions of computers everywhere, there's no identifiable jurisdiction. We can't determine the choice of law. Additionally, it's anonymous. It's in fact quite unclear who the parties are and where they are. It is very true that a smart contract can enter into a smart contract. You can have layers of smart contracts. It's very difficult to determine who exactly the parties are. Also, it's unclear documentation because it's computer code, which of course isn't going to be very readable for someone who doesn't understand computer code. So what that leads you to is sort of the complexities. And I think Ethan also did a very nice job of kind of, there's a lot of ambiguities here. It's kind of unclear exactly how things are running on the blockchain. It's very unclear with these smart contracts. And the idea to say that computer code is going to prevent any sort of disputes, that's just not true, because we already know that disputes are occurring, because there will be, first of all, inevitable coding errors. People actually do the coding, right? So we're talking about regular human beings who are actually coding these smart contracts and are doing the computer code. Well, they're not perfect, they're not infallible. There will be problems with the computer code itself. Also, there's going to be disputes regarding performances and the nuances that don't quite fit into that sort of if-then paradigm. You think about the vending machine, well, that's all fine and good with a candy bar. But if we're talking about shipping, if you're talking about, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative in Hong Kong, and they're using a lot of smart contracts, well, if there's any questions about whether the shipment truly conforms, well, it's there's a lot of fact-based disputes in there. Right? And so it's not all easy to determine in accordance with a computer code that would prevent all sorts of disputes. Moreover, if any of you who actually hold Bitcoin can attest, values fluctuate wildly. So what if in the beginning of the transaction you think you're going to pay a certain number of Bitcoin, and then of course at the end the value is quite different? The value can fluctuate wildly, and that will create disputes in and of itself. Also, there will be fights over fairness and very fact-based defenses like unconscionability. So this is a little off script, but just last week, it's kind of fun to add this anecdote because it was great and perfect timing for this presentation, because I was in Montreal last week and I did a presentation with Cyber Justice Laboratory, but then I met with the mathematician who is one of the main principals behind Claros, which is one of the companies I'm going to be talking about in a bit that does online dispute resolution for smart contract disputes. And we were talking about, this whole idea of code preventing disputes. And I really got a good sort of understanding of how there are even disputes regarding computer code among computer coders, and in terms of what the computer code actually means. So in fact, there can be ambiguities even within people who believe in computer code. Even computer coders have dispute about the spirit of the code. So sometimes the computer code will actually mean something different to a different computer coder. So again, it just adds to the layer of the type of disputes that we will see regarding smart contracts. So sort of tying in with what Ethan presented and sort of thinking about online dispute resolution and places where it might fit in, well, guess what? This is a perfect place for it. Perfect place to determine these kind of issues on the blockchain and blockchain disputes themselves. Because again, let's go back to the very original premise of blockchain. The idea is that we are talking about, in fact, a lot of them call themselves crypto libertarians, and this idea that they trust the code, they trust the blockchain, they don't trust courts, they don't trust lawyers. So what would you prefer if you're someone who is involved in a smart contract or you hold cryptocurrency and you have a dispute? You're probably going to feel more comfortable submitting your dispute or having your dispute determined on the blockchain, within the blockchain, and by other users of the blockchain who understand the blockchain. So that brings us to blockchain dispute resolution. And arguably the kind of different sorts. And when I did some research regarding all the different sort of startup companies and young companies that are creating different ways to resolve the disputes on the blockchain, I sort of grouped them into three main categories. But as Amy Wan from SageWise, she can definitely clarify when she comes on, because in fact, she's doing really groundbreaking work in this area. And in fact, I probably put her SageWise in the wrong place because it's not necessarily arbitration per se. But one model that is out there is the idea to simply have arbitrators that are on hand to decide disputes on the blockchain. How would this work? Well, imagine if you were in the midst of a smart contract for shipping disputes, for example. And for example, when the ship comes into the harbor, automatically the payment was supposed to be made, almost, and I'm very oversimplifying, but almost like a vending machine, right? Well, what if there's a way that you can push pause on payment for the shipment and allow for a quick arbitration to decide the dispute, if there's a dispute about the quality of the goods or something along those lines? Well, that would be sort of an online arbitration model that could be built into the blockchain. Now, SageWise has a broader array, and Amy can fill you in on that next, so I'll leave that to her. But the next interesting category is really a growing and quite large category, which is crowdsourced dispute resolution. What this is what Claros, Jur, Aragon, Delphi, Rhubarb, and there are many more actually, that are working in this space. And these are companies that are creating essentially crowdsourced dispute resolution. What does that mean? In short, it is tokenized voting on the blockchain. Now, I laugh about whether we could experience mob justice or gamification. And each of these companies, Claros, Jur, Aragon, they have white papers and they set forth different ways that they will actually address and combat that sort of mob justice. But let's unpack that just a bit. What does that mean? It means if you hold a certain number of these tokens, right? So in Claros, they have these Pinkerton, these tokens, and these tokens are used for voting. So let's say I am a juror and I own a certain number of these tokens. I can vote and say, well, I think that A should win or B should win if A and B are in a dispute. And if A wins, and I put all my tokens on A, then I stand to earn more tokens. If B wins, I would lose my tokens. That's a simplified version, but that's essentially the kind of thing that we're talking about with tokenized dispute resolution. And it's crowdsourced because it is truly a jury of your peers. So one could argue from a theoretical model that it's kind of a restorative justice in some ways, not really, because you're not airing out your disputes quite the same way, but they do actually issue briefs. The other benefit of sitting down and really sort of getting behind Claros and getting to see what they're doing last week in Montreal was that I got to see sort of how the parties actually do file briefs. And there are briefs involved and each side will argue their case. And then the jurors, again, who are token holders, will vote on who should win. And theoretically, from a game theoretic model, you would argue, at least you would hope, that the jurors would try to make the best decision based on the facts, because they would think that by doing that, they would win more tokens because they would be more likely to choose the correct winning side. Now, again, there are different ways, however, that there could be gamification, there could be mob justice. I asked a lot of questions about that when I met with Claros, and you know, these are a lot of issues that are still being worked out among these companies. But it's really quite interesting. It's interesting to sort of see how this is working on the blockchain, and again, a jury of your peers, because it's other individuals who understand the blockchain, who work in the blockchain and own tokens. Next, and finally, there could be room for automated, more or less, bot resolutions. And what we mean there is where it could be determined by perhaps predictive analytics, or even more or less between sort of splitting the middle, right? So each side puts forth their what they believe is the proper award, and it could be perhaps split somewhere according to some sort of algorithm or predictive analytics again. All this is to say, however, is how do we really build the optimal online dispute resolution in the blockchain? Again, just going back to the beginning of my presentation, I do think the road to take is online dispute resolution for disputes on the blockchain. It doesn't make any sense to go to a court of law, to a physical court of law regarding smart contract disputes, cryptocurrency disputes. It wouldn't even make sense from a large number of standpoints. So you sort of have to use online dispute resolution. The questions really come into what should it look like? What should that online dispute resolution look like? And of course, Amy's going to be talking more about this, but I just want to offer a few thoughts. Again, there's a clear need. It's just impractical to code for all possible breaches of contract. There's going to be bugs in the system. There will be fraud. We already know that. There will be unconscionability. There's going to be unpredictable behavior. And so it's also important to preserve the anonymity and efficiency of blockchain dispute resolution. Given that, however, we cannot simply just throw away due process and simply ignore ethics. And so we've got to think about insistence on ethical design and execution. I believe that's absolutely important to come up with standards and principles that are applicable to this kind of online dispute resolution so that it doesn't become simple mob justice. One thing to look at is the I-coder principles, and certainly Ethan and Orna can speak to that. Ethan being behind all of this, who I really value for everything he's done in the space, has really worked a tremendous amount on these different principles and standards for ethics, along with Professor Wing, who also works with Ethan with the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution. Some additional ideas for designing ODR for smart contracts. And I just want to break this down into 5 key points again, and just to sort of solidify and keep it as simple as I can. Number 1 is escrow. I think to really further this idea of creating different mechanisms for resolving these kind of disputes on the blockchain, especially when I think about shipping, or I think about record keeping, or you think about the different use cases that could grow and become quite important. In fact, Estonia is putting nearly all their public records on the blockchain in order to keep them safe, because they trust the distributed ledger greater than there is a trust in government, right? So this kind of distributed ledger can actually have value for that. Well, if you're going to have disputes, though, you should allow for escrow. What I mean there is posting currency to be held until a dispute is resolved. This, again, this idea that you could push pause on enforcement of a smart contract and then quickly allow for the dispute to be resolved through some kind of online dispute resolution mechanism. And then the escrow would be released once the dispute is resolved. Choice. Providing an array of options for resolving disputes. We talk about this quite often with online dispute resolution in allowing freedom of choice and personal decision. Some people may prefer a bot resolution that's quick and fast and just gets it done. Others may choose crowdsource because they trust the crowd. Others may prefer an arbitrator who perhaps has a specialty or expertise in the area of the dispute. Alerts, using some kind of tracking mechanism. I know SageWise has something that Amy hopefully will talk about, in using tracking to alert the parties of a problem in verification of execution. I think there's a great deal of value. You know, think about Google alerts, or think about different alerts that we have on our system. Or I know for my banking, for example, if a transaction looks like it's fraudulent, looks like it wasn't me because it was in a location that I never have been to and I'm not going and I'm not traveling to, well, then my bank will alert me that something might be wrong with my bank account. Imagine if we have an alert system of this type for enforcement of smart contracts, that we don't run into a problem where the contract is automatically executed, paid out, but indeed to the wrong party, to a fraudulent party who has drained or infiltrated the system. Because guess what? The blockchain can be hacked. We already know that. There have been several hacks that have made national news. International news. Also standards, again, establishing ethical principles for fair procedures. And then finally, audits, monitoring the system to catch improprieties and to catalyze improvements. As with any technology, I think it's very important that we do audits so that we can then improve and address the different problems that we see in the system. So I want to thank you very much, and please feel free to reach out to me with questions. My email is schmitzaj@missouri.edu. Also, a lot of my articles are available for free on SSRN through the link that is noted. So I just want to thank you, thank Orna, thank Ethan, thank you all. And I don't know if you were going to have any questions or if we're moving along.
Um, Thank you, Amy, so much, and thanks for waking up Missouri time. I think we would like to save the questions till after. Amy, can you stay on with us, or do you
Oh,
need to
I'd
get
love
out?
to hear what Amy, yeah, because
Okay, great.
I think
So
it's
then
going to be a
we'll
great.
open it up for a discussion afterwards. Thank you so much. So we're switching from one Amy to the next, and we'll be back with you in a short while.
Sounds wonderful.
Thank you. Okay, so how do we? Is Amy? Let's see if she was on earlier.
I'm here. I'm here.
Oh, hey,
Can you hear
Amy.
me? Can
Yes.
you see me?
Hi. So this is pure chance that all our female speakers are called Amy. It's wonderful to have you with us, and thank you so much for waking up California time.
Of course.
We have a room full of people who are interested in blockchain and ODR, and would love to hear your input on the matter.
Fantastic.
I spoke about your bio earlier, so we can go straight to the talk. Thanks.
Okay. All right, sounds good. So basically, I'm going to be speaking about two things today. One is how SageWise has architected its dispute resolution system, and the second thing I'm going to talk about is EOS. And EOS, if for those of you who don't quite know, EOS is a very large cryptocurrency. I think right now in terms of market cap, it's number 5. They raised about $4 billion through their ICO, which is an incredible amount. And they are what we call a governed blockchain that actually incorporated an arbitration system into their governance model. So that will be a little bit more of a case study, if you will. So I'm going to start off first with SageWise. So SageWise is a company that myself and my co-founder Dan Rice founded back in fall of 2017. And really the reason why we started looking at this was, I'm a securities attorney by training. And so in early 2017, I actually used to run the Legal Hackers Meetup in Los Angeles, and I invited Dan to come over and speak to my group about smart contracts. So the case study that he gave was about the DAO, the Decentralized Autonomous Organization, which for those of you who don't know, it's basically a decentralized hedge fund, if you will, that was started back in 2016. The whole idea was, hey, people should contribute their Ether. At this time, Ethereum was not very large and not that active. It was still very, very new, right? So the idea was, hey, contribute some of your cryptocurrency, some of your Ether to this hedge fund, and we will have this wonderful smart contract where code is law, right? And we will upvote or downvote proposals to we'll upvote or downvote the funding of proposals. But what actually ended up happening was that a hacker came along and basically made off with about 50% of the funds of the DAO, which at that time was about $150 million worth. And in response, the entire thesis around all this stuff was code is law, right? And when the hacker actually ended up making off with all this money, the community essentially split into two. There was half the community that said, oh, well, code is law. This should all be okay because, he found a vulnerability in the smart contract, and that's how the smart contract executed, and that's that. And then the other half of the community, because they had actually lost money, suddenly they thought, hey, this isn't fair. This is not what we originally intended. We need to call the police. We need to call the cops. Who can help us, right? So that was really funny. What they ended up doing was they actually hard forked the entire Ethereum blockchain, which is why there's now Ethereum as you know it today and Ethereum Classic. Hard forking, for those of you who don't know, basically means you're cloning the blockchain and then you're resetting the transaction that you didn't want to happen. So hard forking is a very, it's like the nuclear option, and you definitely don't want to do it very often. You know, to the extent that you do hard fork a blockchain, you're basically choosing winners and losers, right? A lot of times it'll be the small transactions, the small disputes that that don't get a hard fork, but the big ones, the quote unquote important ones that do, and so that's not really fair. So basically, he was explaining this at our meetup, and I saw this and I thought, well, this is interesting. This looks like a security, right? And this was all back in 2017 when, people were going crazy. In 2017, more was raised in venture capital than more was raised in ICOs than was raised in venture capital. And around this time, it seemed like it was every other week that a smart contract was getting hacked. And when they were getting hacked for, it wasn't like $50, $100. It was like $10 million, $300 million. Oops, we deleted some code. This is a real thing. Oops, we deleted some code. We lost $200 million, right? And so that didn't really sound right to me. It didn't sound, the technology didn't sound workable, but also this is just not the way human beings work, right? And so I called up Dan, we discussed the issue, and we basically decided that smart contracts would basically be unworkable without some sort of dispute resolution infrastructure. So that's what we started off with building. Now, since then, I think we've basically taken two different approaches, right? One approach is, what kind of dispute resolution architecture do you have if the smart contract and the underlying blockchain is decentralized? The other one is, well, what happens if everything's centralized? And I don't know, didn't wake up early enough to find out whether you guys talked about private or permission to blockchains, but that's basically where it's controlled more so by a consortium of folks instead of, random nodes from all around the world. So there's a little bit more control there. So for the decentralized solution, the architecture that we came up with is simply this. So we basically start with something called contract canary. If you guys have heard of, the phrase canary in the coal mine, it warns you if something is going wrong, right? So that's the same concept here, and it's the alert system that the other Amy was talking about earlier, where basically we would, basically when you are going about setting up your smart contract, it looks a lot like AAA's clause builder, right? Except that it's in code. So you would log on to, or you don't even have to log on to a website. You basically go onto a website and you set parameters around how you want disputes to be resolved. You could say, hey, I want AAA or JAMS or some other formal, arbitration group to get this dispute. You can say, hey, I want one arbitrator, I want 3 arbitrators. You would also set certain parameters around warnings, right? Hey, I want the smart contract execution to be delayed by 24 hours, by 36 hours. These are the instances in which I want execution delayed. Whenever, in a 24-hour period, there are funds being extracted from the smart contract to the tune of more than $10,000, or if there are transactions being extracted from the smart contract more than X amount in value, right? So you set all those parameters, and then once your smart contract goes live, there is something called Contract Canary that basically monitors your smart contract. So this entire thing is basically set up like speed bumps, like a warning system, right? When the smart contract normally should execute, it would not. Instead, it would, the execution would be delayed by however much amount of time you set, maybe 24 hours, right? And you know, you would basically get an alert on your cell phone, either a text or mobile or something saying, hey, your smart contract is set to self-execute in this way in about 24 hours. Is this right or not? And if it seems right, then that's fine. You don't do anything and you just let it go. But if it doesn't seem right, then you would basically click a button on your phone, and that would allow you to freeze execution of the smart contract. And then it takes you through a whole dispute resolution process to basically figure out what's going wrong. Now, the other Amy talked about, you know, the vast number of issues that could be wrong. It could be a coding bug. It could be the parties changed their mind, or, you know, we didn't code the smart contract the way we had originally intended. Whatever it is, basically, once you freeze a smart contract, we don't speed you all the way into dispute resolution right then and there, right? You know, 95% of disputes often are resolved by the parties themselves, right? It may just be a mistake in the drafting of the contract. So first, we take them through a self-resolution process. And that's to really make this entire system a lot more scalable. It's to, you know, ensure low transactional costs, and it's to, you know, try and get the parties to resolve things themselves. Now, to the extent that they cannot resolve things themselves, then they are basically taken to the provider that they pre-appointed. Now, earlier I mentioned, you know, the AAA clause builder idea, where basically you're setting a number of parameters. One of those would be, hey, if we end up in a dispute, I want, you know, this provider to go ahead and resolve my dispute. Now, if for any reason that provider no longer exists, or the parties mutually agree that they want to switch providers, you know, maybe it was a $10 million smart contract, but really this is a tiny issue that's worth, you know, $1,000, and they don't want it to go to full-blown arbitration, they can go back, right, and basically look at a whole marketplace of basically ODR providers. And we imagine this marketplace will have a variety of approaches, right? Because dispute resolution is not a one-size-fits-all thing. It could be, hey, we're going to, you know, flip a digital coin, and, you know, heads I win, tail you win, right? It could be, you know, formal mediation or arbitration. It could be, you know, we're going to play a game of chess, whatever it is. It could be the crowd juries that we talked about earlier, you know, the Claroses and those sorts of things, right? Because, you know, at the end of the day, every party, we believe that it's the parties themselves that are best positioned to understand how much the dispute is worth to them. And I realize that I'm taking way more time than I'm allotted, so I'm going to speed this along. Okay, so basically, you go to the marketplace. We take you to your provider. The provider comes up with some sort of resolution, and at the very end, we have collection and enforcement tools, because we don't expect, you know, formal arbitrators or whatever to know how to code out a resolution. This should all be able to be scaled in a very user-friendly fashion. So that's the whole decentralized solution. The centralized solution is so much easier, right? When you're looking at centralized smart contracts, we already have them in the world. Amazon is a centralized smart contract. If you click the buy now button, you know, all these things happen in between, and suddenly a package ends up in your door in 2 to 7 days, depending on whether or not you have Amazon Prime. So for centralized solutions, the dispute resolution system doesn't need to be nearly as complex. We believe that large enterprises will code out their own dispute resolution system, and it's really going to be small businesses that don't have a lot of resources that are going to need some sort of much more common system. So that is SageWise. Now I'm going to talk about EOS. So like I mentioned, EOS is a top 5 market cap cryptocurrency that raised, basically about 4 billion USD back in 2017, 2018. And then they basically launched, or they went live in June 2018. Now, the original EOS white paper basically envisioned a governed blockchain, one that would encapsulate the concept of property rights and recourse as a competitive differentiator. The other competitive differentiator is that there's only 21 what we call block producers or official nodes, right, that are recording transactions. So it's supposed to be a lot more efficient and faster than Ethereum. So the EOS mainnet basically launched with a constitution that referred to an arbitration mechanism. And that arbitration mechanism is what we call the EOS Core Arbitration Forum, or ECAF for short. So basically, there's 3 arms of governance to the EOS blockchain. There is the token holders who can vote. There is the block producers. There's 21 of them. And lastly, there would be ECAF. So basically, in the months that followed since the EOS mainnet launch, very quickly, they already got hundreds of disputes, most of them around issues of unregistered wallets, phishing scams, hacks. And unfortunately, what happened was that in the first few cases, arbitrators from ECAF, and by the way, everyone working under ECAF was a volunteer, right? So I want you to keep that in mind. So, and they were not, arbitration or dispute resolution professionals. They were technologists. And so the arbitrators from ECAF issued several orders to block producers to freeze several wallets to prevent the transfer of stolen tokens in several disputes. And this actually generated a really negative reaction from the EOS token holder community. And I believe that was due in part to the extreme lack of transparency in the process, because when they issued these orders, they basically said, hey, freeze these wallets and we will tell you the reasoning later. And the community thought this was outrageous. And basically, since then, community members have called into question the very existence of ECAF, of dispute resolution on the EOS blockchain. And there was a huge debate over base layer arbitration. So the idea of base layer arbitration is the question of, do we want dispute resolution arbitration to be the default within this community, or to let it be optional, right? And if it's optional, you'd have to either opt in or opt out. They also questioned where ECAF derived its authority from. They were also trying to rewrite the entire Constitution. There were several versions of the Constitution flying around. And so in, I think, July of 2018, I was called in by one of the leaders of EOS to help them figure out how to architect a dispute resolution system for EOS that would be scalable and a lot more acceptable to the community. So I'll tell you what we came up with, and then I'll tell you what has happened since the first couple of months of EOS, right? So we ended up forming a working group with a lot of wonderful people. We had, we had Colin Rule on it. We had a number of folks from all around the world. And so basically we came up with a proposal that I'm going to briefly describe. And if this sounds crazy to you, it's okay, because basically what we were trying to do was create the best system for this community, right? And you have to remember, a lot of the cryptocurrency community, it's very libertarian. No one wants to pay for anything. Everyone wants freedom of choice. No one wants to be bound by any higher authority, right? And so we basically said, okay, well, we have to form some sort of overarching organization separate from ECAF. We didn't want to be involved in the politics of ECAF. And we said that this organization would have the following responsibilities. You know, it would have to have some sort of head that would act as a spokesperson for EOS dispute resolution. That spokesperson would educate and socialize the dispute resolution system. They would regularly report on the state of dispute resolution on the EOS network to understand, you know, the overarching economic health of the network, and signal to providers what additional types of dispute resolution providers would be needed. It would act as a clearinghouse for disputes, so on and so forth. So in terms of how the dispute resolution system was supposed to be architected, we came up with two processes. One was, to the extent that you wanted to set your own process, that was fine. You had your freedom of choice to do that. And that includes the freedom of choice to completely opt out of any sort of dispute resolution if that's what you wanted to do. And we architected it that way because there was no, it got to the point in the community where, you know, there was just going to be no way that we would get any sort of consensus unless we allowed for a choice in which people just didn't want any recourse at all. The second process was what we call the default process, right? And so basically, the way that was set up was that if a dispute resolution process was not specified in a smart contract or transaction on the EOS network, then, you know, to the extent that you had a dispute, it had to be timely filed with the dispute resolution organization. And basically, they would have to go to the dispute resolution organization's website and fill out a survey with a number of questions. And those questions would basically filter out for an appropriate provider based on certain criteria, right? So we would ask you, what's the overall disputed amount, right? Disputes worth a lot more are going to definitely want something more like maybe one or a panel of people looking at it, versus a much smaller dispute over 50 cents. You're probably going to want some sort of bot to handle it, right? So things of that sort, including, you know, what's the actual issue. And then based on how that survey was filled out, the dispute resolution group's website would basically act as a clearinghouse. It would filter down to provide a short list of the best providers for that sort of dispute. Everything on the marketplace of providers would have to adhere to some sort of standard of dispute resolution. And it would basically round robin between different providers for disputes of the same type, right? And so we were really trying to fit the form to the fuss. So that's, you know, that's the solution that we came up with. We've never ended up having a chance to formally present this proposal to the EOS community, although I've mentioned it to the community many times, because basically things broke down even more. As I mentioned earlier, ECAF was entirely run by volunteers, and the first head of ECAF got so much criticism, despite the fact that he was doing this full-time for free, because everyone's a critic. And so he ended up stepping down a couple months after the mainnet launched, and someone else replaced him. But you know, ECAF never recovered from the reputational damage of the first couple orders. And so literally there's a voting system, a referendum system it's called, for ECAF. And there's literally a referendum vote going on right now called decaf. They want to delete ECAF from the EOS mainnet system, and 99% of people have voted yes. Now, I want you to understand that a lot of the people in the cryptocurrency community and in the EOS community, they're not, governance or legal or dispute resolution professionals. So they don't really understand what they're voting on. They conflate ECAF with dispute resolution in general, right? That and the one thing I asked in order to present my proposal was for funding. And funding, no one's ever gotten it together. And so, I'm reluctant to present this if we don't have the ability to actually hire a team of professionals to actually, work on this exclusively, as opposed to, this decentralized thing where, oh, everyone's going to contribute, but it's unorganized, it's inefficient, it's a little bit tragedy of the commons thing going on. So that is the case study of the first arbitration and dispute resolution system on a public blockchain. And unfortunately, I don't think we can say that it's been a success, but hopefully in the future, we'll see something else.
A learning experience, the rise and fall of ECAF, right? So hopefully we'll see the rise and rise of SageWise. Amy, thank you so much. Really, I think we can give a round of applause to all three speakers. This was truly illuminating. I'll say just a few words. I'll ask Ethan if he wants to add something else, and maybe we'll open it up for just a few questions. We have to wrap up at 1:15. But I think, what we've seen here is a story of, this sort of resistance or rhetorics. But I think beyond the rhetorics, an ideology or a culture that, at least in its, in the beginning, but not only the beginning, because the story of ECAF is a recent one, has real resistance to dispute resolution, and in a way, a true belief in the ability to overcome disputes, and sees trust maybe less as a human construct and as something that can be generated through, a combination of software, incentives, and structure, if they're sort of in the right composition. And these beliefs, the idea of immutability and and disintermediation, and the significance of anonymity, it struck me were somewhat in tension with some of the basic tenets of at least modern day dispute system design. The need to identify someone or certain figures who will take responsibility for handling the disputes and will function as dispute resolvers, and the idea that dispute resolution requires context, and therefore also knowing who your partners to this effort are, and the recognition that disputes are inevitable. Even if as we had a discussion earlier, are they on the rise, are they increasing or not? But there's certainly, I think within the dispute resolution field, there's a recognition that disputes are inevitable, and a belief that the trust is a human construct. And the trust is required not only to facilitate transactions, but also to allow people to trust dispute resolution mechanisms and processes. And you've seen that breakdown in ECAF, and that's exactly what it was, breakdown in the legitimacy of the structure. So on the one hand, we have these rhetorics, but also a growing recognition, this is all just happening, that we do need dispute resolution on the blockchain, that this is probably going to take the one form or another of ODR and not courts. There are probably over 10 providers out there, not providers, ventures that are trying to create ODR models and structures out there. Many of them, in a way, emulate some of the characteristics of the blockchain itself. I don't know if emulate or feel that they need to adapt to the environment. And then you have the tokenized justice and juror voting that Amy described earlier. But some also bring in the world of dispute resolution, which I think we've heard more about in your presentation, where They try to also provide what we call process pluralism, so more of a variety. They try not only to rely on decision-based dispute resolution processes, but also on consensual dispute resolution. They realize the limits of scaling when you rely on humans and the role maybe for what Ethan has termed in the past the fourth party. And I think one of the major questions that lies in the background and will have to be dealt with in the future, it might be a challenge, is, you know, what's going to be the driving force for people, institutions, settings to adopt these mechanisms. And in that respect, EOS is an interesting example, the rise and fall of EOS, right? But I think that's going to be an ongoing challenge. You know, what's going to drive people to adopt these smart contracts that do include these clauses and will allow them to deal with the disputes later on. So I'll pass it on to Ethan if you want some closing remarks, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Well, I don't really think I need the microphone for this, but I have always wondered whether we have enough arbitrators. Every time I hear that we're going to call on an arbitrator to resolve this disputes, I've asked how many arbitrators we have, and I don't have the numbers on this, but there can't be enough. So that's what I wonder about.
Well, thank you very much for all three of you. This is, I mean, eye-opening, and I have tons of questions, but right now I'll just, one concern, and perhaps this relates a little bit to the Amy's, a little bit more maybe to Amy Schmitz, and that's, and this, I mean, this may be an open and recognized question. I'm not an expert in this field, but every system, especially if you're an automated system, like every contract, exists somehow in a balance between the costs of formation, how much are you investing in putting the deal together, and the expectation of loss if it collapses afterwards. So how many, and this is done, I mean, lawyers do it all the time, but they do it mostly intuitively. They don't have necessarily very sophisticated models. I mean, how much are you going to, how many defenses, how much are you going to plan ahead, how many, because all this is part of the investment in the formation of the contract, and how much are you going just to, so the systems, we were talking about complexity before. One of the reasons that we think about blockchain and smart contracts as attractive is that they're very simple to use and relatively cheap to put in the field. So the more defenses you put in them, the more complicated they're going to be, the more costly they are going to devising them is going to be more costly. I get your point about having generic sort of systems for platforms for the use of small businesses that can come up with their own. That's going to be very nice. So you're going to pick something off the shelf, so to speak. And my question is there a theoretical model that explains this? That explains, on the one hand, the attractiveness of the systems. I'm not saying, you already say, Thomas, I mean, we are complicating it, and maybe it's very good, because right now hackers can take, get the $200 million and, and go figure. But is the trade-off recognized? And is there a theoretical model, or more than one model, that explains how this trade-off is being, because you're going to end up with a smart contract that will have so many defenses in so many stops, and will have everything. It will have the alerts, and have the escrow. The moment somebody said escrow, I cringe, because there's an escrow. You're taking one of the more, the least efficient systems from commercial law in order to, and more open to interpretation.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on this very short issue. There are a lot of externalities here.
Mhm.
It seems to me that you have to think here when you're creating an ODR about the whole, because it seems like the community is really affected by one small issue or one contract, which has a lot of implications, a lot of externalities. So that should come into analysis as well.
Yeah, I don't know if that's a question for me or
Yeah.
to address that, but yeah, I mean, I love those questions. I think they're incredibly important. I mean, you talk about this on cost effect, you talk about externalities, you talk about adding complexities to what was originally supposed to be a simple process. And in my mind, I like to sort of go back to history. And when you talk about theoretical underpinnings, I think about the birth of, in the United States, the Uniform Commercial Code, Article 2, and the Uniform Commercial Code in general. So this was meant to simplify the process, right? So they created, especially the sale of goods, that is the Uniform Commercial Code, Article 2. I'm just using that because it's within the history that I know here in the US, and I'm sure you have similar stories there, is the idea was that a bunch of business people got together and tried to simplify the code, and it was all going to sort of eliminate questions about the enforcement of the sale of goods and the enforcement of using secured transactions in the case of Article 9. But the exact same thing happened, right? So externalities came in, people started bringing the complexities. It's not quite as simple as they originally thought. In fact, even when you look at the birth of arbitration, arbitration can be dated back to ancient Egypt. And actually there's arbitrations in the Bible. I mean, arbitration is very, very old. Well, as soon as lawyers got involved with the New York Convention and the Federal Arbitration Act here in the US, it started to become more complex and become more or less judicialized. So your question is a good one. I think as far as the theoretical construct, I think there are a lot of examples from history that, you know, history teaches. And I think if we look back at history, we can see, and there'll come a time where we'll be juxtaposing these histories in the area of transactions. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
It continues the question. It continues the exploration of it. It's not a question that has a clear answer. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Yes, thank you. It was very helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, folks? Well, thank you so much again for sharing your morning and our afternoon. And we hope to continue the discussion in other forums, and we'll be in touch. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Yeah. Thanks,
Bye.
guys.